I'm Michael Fox, and this is the Prospector Podcast. And I have joining me the Chief Geoscientist, Dr. Dave Lawie of Index in Australia. Crikey, we're back at her again, Dave.
Crikey indeed, and 12 hours apart, I think. But yes, and hi, Mike, and glad to be on the pod again.
Yeah, it's sometimes we have to do this with half a world between us, and every once in a while we get to be in the same place at the same time. You and I were talking off mic. We get to see each other in London in a few weeks. It's a couple of months' time, I guess, at the Resourcing Tomorrow conference. It'll be held in London the first week of December, and I look forward to doing part two of this conversation at that time. But today I wanted to talk about the giant elephant that's in the room. We keep, and we've had long discussions over the last year and a bit about critical metals and the gap in between what we have and what we need, all the challenges surrounding critical metals. But I want to talk about the elephant in the room, which is the compromise. China controls a lot of these critical metals because basically they can. They have no environmental regulations. They have very little human regulations attached to it. And as a result, they can process these metals, which are very toxic to process, without any regard to the ESG that everybody in the Western world needs to follow. So in order for us as a Western society to kind of break that Chinese monopoly when it comes to these critical metals, there's going to have to be compromise. So that is our word for today, is compromise.
Yeah, and I think it's worth just also reflecting that the Western world, if you want to call it that, has been extremely happy with that compromise for decades. And it's only really been in the later 3, 4, 5 years that it's occurred to people that the supply chain is extremely constrained and dominated, let's just call it a single point of failure, which is no good for anyone, really.
No, they certainly they have control over it. In one of my critical metals panels last year in Miami, actually in February, I had a conversation with a couple of parties regarding the Five Eyes program for nuclear subs, which Australia is a part of. And it was going to require a ton of various critical metals, of which 90% of them were completely controlled by China, in order to build nuclear subs that were supposed to patrol the South China Sea. And I just looked and said, like, are they really going to sell you those rare earths in order to do that? And, the person kind of looked at me with a blank look and shrugged their shoulders, and that was it. But that seems to be the nature of these compromise discussions. They just kind of give you a blank look and shrug the shoulders, and nobody wants to talk about it.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good example of people's blindness to supply chains, and you could generalize that to just where does stuff come from. And I think talking about nuclear submarines, but talking about the car industry itself, with the starting out of EVs and requirement for different metals to manufacture yet more magnets, batteries, etc. I think the car industry got a bit of a shock when they realised that cobalt doesn't come out of a tap, nor does lithium, nor does manganese, nor do many other metals as well, that there's a whole supply chain that lies behind it, which at that point in time was, for some of these metals at least anyway, barely developed. And for the ones that were developed, were the end products they needed for manufacturing were coming from one place. So I think that was a bit of a jolt to the entire system, and I think has started a lot of the recognition that the supply chains need to be at a bare minimum diversified. But that brings in a second problem. It's easy to make a strategic paper at governmental level saying we need to diversify our supply chains. It is quite another thing actually to do that. And I think that's something we can talk about, the how we can go about that, and how difficult it is, and the compromises that will entail, which I think are in a large part underappreciated, even by the governments that are trying to achieve it.
And quite frankly, there's challenges across the entire supply chain. Like if we go to just the very grassroots of the critical metal supply chain, which is mines that are going to produce the metals, which then have to go to a processing plant that processes them so that they're capable of being manufactured into the final goods. But even at the mining level, in order to bring enough mines on in the Western world to supply our needs for these critical metals, they need thousands and thousands of qualified people to do the work in these mines. And we're simply not at an educational level graduating enough engineers and geologists and geochemists to supply the mining industry to even extract the ore at this point.
Yeah, I have a bit to do with the universities around the world, as you know, Mike, but, like UWA and the MDRU at UBC. But talking to the MDRU just lately, there has been an uptick in enrolments in geoscience. I don't know about mining engineer, but I think Colorado School of Mines may be seeing an uptick in mining engineering as well. And I think somewhat, at least, the concept of requirements for critical minerals, we must call them that, for the energy transition, I think is actually tweaking younger people in a positive way, looking at the industry in a slightly more positive light. And, thank goodness that seems to be happening, because the industry as a whole needs, not just these young people coming into it, but needs the best and brightest, because we're facing some truly intractable challenges.
Yeah, but even then, those young people, it's at least 5 years before they're done with their schooling to be able to get to even think about getting a job in the industry. And in the meantime, you have a workforce that's rapidly aging out and looking to retire rather than continue working for indefinite periods of time.
Yeah, I think in general the industry is facing a great retirement wave. I think in the next decade that is known. I haven't heard any great solutions around it as yet, and people think that AI will take over these processes. I think that's a stretch, to say the least. But getting back to the mining, processing, and then the industrial use, I think when you put it all together, because that is the whole supply chain, there's not many places, not many countries can mine it, process it, and then use the end product industrially all in the one place. China is good at it, obviously, amazingly good at it, but the rest of the world not so much. So one of the things that's worth thinking about if we want to diversify these supply chains is these supply chains. If we're going to friendshore them, if you want to use that word, and it's not a bad one, but these supply chains will involve multiple countries cooperating in ways which they typically haven't done before, which again is another one of these things that sounds all right in a PowerPoint, but then you've got to look at the economics of it, of who gets what part of that pie for what price, which is an interesting discussion to have. That is going on a bit. I think you mentioned the Five Eyes consortium or partnership a while back, Mike, but there's another one here which we call the Quad. There's, of course, a few of these things around the world, and that comprises Japan, India, Australia, and the USA, not Canada. Sort of a bit odd. It could have been in there, I would have thought. But even in the Quad, there are people writing papers now that saying within those four countries, there, with the political wherewithal and the money, there is the capability to have a mining, processing, and industrial consumption supply chain within those four countries. If, to put it in French, we could get our shit together to do exactly that. But it's not, it is possible. Even the political will seems to be there now, but you've got to be able to do it economically. And I think one of the things which is going to be very difficult to navigate in broadening supply chains is these aren't going to be the most pure economically efficient supply chains. We had those, and when we had those, we saw the concentration of the supply chain boil down to basically a single point of failure, but it was cheap. If we want to diversify the supply chains, it's not going to be cheap, it's going to be expensive, and I think significantly more expensive. So how the Western world copes with that is an open question.
Yeah, and even on that friendshoring kind of equation, as it sits right now, you mentioned about China mining, processing, and manufacturing. I would question the mining part of that, but they've been very good at acquiring those resources from areas of the world where they do mine those resources. And here we seem to, in the United States, as an example, they have large copper and large nickel deposits that could be mineable in the United States, and the government's blocking the mining of them, and they would rather see it mined someplace else. In Canada, we have, the government has cut off Chinese capital from taking over Canadian mining companies, yet they've left the offtakes of the minerals still go to China. So yeah, China doesn't need to own the mining company. They've got the offtakes, so the mineral still ends up in China. So there's a U.S. election, as you're aware. One of the platforms of the Democrats is to create a critical metals reserve, strategic reserve in the United States for metals that they deem to be critical, very similar to what they do with oil and they do with uranium. But again, if you don't have the ability to process that and you're not actually mining it from your own country, where's that metal going to come from?
Yeah, the upgrading and processing of these materials. I mean, we've spoken in the past about the sheer difficulty of finding the stuff from a mining point of view. The other side of the equation of that is once you mine it, is processing it into something useful, and that's diabolically difficult, but in just different ways. So even the uranium supply chain is a bit of a panic now because most of the upgrading of that takes place offshore to the USA and other countries, France, which is a problem. We're seeing some resource nationalisation of uranium resources in Nigeria, for example. There was a Canadian and a French company had their uranium mines taken off them, possibly to end up in the hands of the Russians. But the processing of things like rare earths, that is just a really, it's a difficult problem. It's a very, very technically challenging process to refine rare earths into their individual products so they can be used in magnets, etc. And again, that is just going to take time and expense. But I can give you a little positive story, Mike, about something that might be a bit of a microcosm around how the world deals with some of these things. So it's just a shout out to my mates at Element 25. That's the little manganese miner here in WA, taking on the bigger manganese miners. Now, manganese is on the critical metals list, critical minerals list. It's used in battery chemistries and other things. Now, for this mine to diversify the supply chain in manganese, it's required them to sign an offtake agreement with Stellantis, which is a giant European car manufacturer, dealing directly with them. And they're going to mine it here, but they're going to process the manganese at a plant which is going to be built in Louisiana in the USA. And that's being partly funded by the Inflation Reduction Act. So Uncle Joe is tipping in, I can't remember the exact number, maybe 170 million US dollars or something to build the plant there. But that's a really good example of establishing a new secure supply chain from a geopolitical point of view. But it would not have happened or would not have been possible without the Inflation Reduction Act, I don't think. It is it's a good story. It's a slightly annoying story, being an Australian, thinking, well, why couldn't we go downstream and do the refining? Not that level of support here for those sorts of projects, or the lowest hanging fruit was the US government came and with open arms and said, come here, we've got the money, build it here and generate jobs and give us a source of manganese, pure manganese for battery production in country. So just a little example of where things may go and where government lubrication with money around these things, I think, is going to be absolutely essential to broaden out the supply chains. There are a couple of think tanks here in Oz that think about these things as well, and they look at these supply chains and they boil the problem down to what they call 3 S's, and this was some work done by some guys at the ANU, the Australian National University. But they talk about the issues in terms of scalability, security, and sustainability. And it's an interesting way to look at it. So the scalability is simply getting enough of it. And I think this is another element of building out new supply chains, is the sheer volume of stuff you need to build out the supply chains to make the system less fragile is enormous. And I don't think people quite get that. So we need to mine more stuff for sure, but then we need to increase processing capacity to turn it into products in a separate supply chain. There's a security aspect, so that's one thing that's driving a lot of this. But a little bit at the end there, the sustainability, it's really an ESG discussion. So people, you made the comment that, well, people are resistant to building mines. Well, if people may be resistant to building the processing plants to turn these mined products into end-use industrial products, they may be resistant to that as well. Not sure, but it's certainly going to take a lot of money and a lot of investment, and a lot of these industries aren't particularly nice industry, the smelters and chemical plants and things like that. But I think in a way it's an education process. These things, I wouldn't say, are any more terrible than giant petrochemical complexes. People just need to get their minds around it. The other thing, even if people can get their minds around all of that, is the sheer time involved. This is going to be, no matter how serious we get about it, to really get this done is going to, we're talking decades here, 1, 2, 3 decades. That is a bloody long time. If you add that to the lead time for bringing new mining production on stream, I have a term for this, which we can talk about in London, called it's a Schrodinger's type thing. Not all of this can be true at the same time. Something has to fail, or there needs to be some key compromises, as we're talking about now, to get these things through. And some of these compromises are going to have to take place in the Western world on the ESG front.
Yeah, no, exactly. Like, as we spoke off mic, you and I were both at a conference that was put on by the New York chapter of the SME last May. And there was a gentleman from the Department of Energy from the United States government there. And I'm listening to the presentation and I'm looking at the slides, and it's just like, did nobody read your slides? Because slide 3, bullet point 4 was that in order to be part of the American critical metals supply chain, you had to have the highest ESG standards. That's all fine and dandy until you get to slide 4 and bullet point 6, where they bought their germanium from the People's Republic of the Congo. And it's like, there's one of the worst ESG countries in the world, and then you're buying your germanium from the Congo, as you're also buying cobalt, but they didn't want to talk about the cobalt. They tried to slip the germanium through. That's a prime example where the government's already making compromise, but they're not wanting to talk about it.
Yeah, and I think that's just a fact of life in the meantime, until some of these things can be sorted into something that's a bit more palatable. But it just, I suppose, things like that, it just is what it is. I think, by the time people listen to this podcast, they will have read about Rio acquiring Arcadium. And I think that, like element 25, I think that's another microcosm of supply chains and resource security. So, Rio's gone, and another thing actually I want to talk about. So, in previous podcasts, we've spoken about the mining industry perhaps being, short term. It's hard for the mining industry to do anything with a 18 2-year look, outlook for the markets and the capital markets, etc. Very difficult. And certainly Arcadium, after they rolled up into this new company, were finding that, and they were unloved on the share market because the lithium price is down by up to 90%, I think, which they were fine, but it made life difficult. But Rio has always had a really long-term view of lithium, and their CEO makes a really interesting comment, I think, for a major CEO in a mining company, that we're not worried about the price of lithium now, we're worried about it in 10 and 20 years from now. And that's quite interesting, to the point where they've gone and put their money on the table and spent, nearly $10 billion, Australian at least, to buy Arcadium. Now, I think the really interesting thing about Arcadium is, yes, it's securing a whole lot of lithium, but they're virtually one of the only integrated lithium producers that can provide lithium end product independent of a Chinese supply chain. And so when you look at that, you think, well, I don't think it's stated as such, but strategically to have a complete lithium supply chain, and right through from mining and processing and industrial output, completely independent of that. Who knows what that might be worth in 5 or 10 years. I just think that's a really, really interesting strategic move. And again, maybe a pointer to the future. And I think the other interesting aspect of Rio and Arcadium is a bit like the element 25 story, dealing with the car companies going vertical straight to suppliers for their own supply chains. Is that one of the comments from Rio about this deal was that the customers of lithium want big companies, big stable companies in their own supply chains. And so this also made it attractive for Rio to go and supply that or acquire that so they can supply it as a major global player. And they talk about then being able to supply lithium and aluminium and other things with direct agreements to manufacturers, which I think strategically is quite a different move and sort of quite a good eye to the future.
Yeah, I think the auto industry itself has kind of woken up to this problem long, actually, in advance of government in a lot of ways. You've seen Stellantis, who you mentioned, that are, securing their manganese supply from the Australian mine to be processed in Louisiana in the United States in order for them to have the manganese for the batteries that they're going to have to put in their electric cars. They've done similar things with the lithium supply chain in places like Argentina, where they've invested and locked up, their lithium supply, in other areas of the world, so that they can make sure that they have the product to make the batteries that have to go into the electrified vehicles as we go forward. But if we actually take a look at the current electric vehicle market, China owns that market. They own our asses in the electric vehicle market. And they've done so by securing their supply chain up and down the line, to the point where the Western automakers can't get enough material to manufacture the batteries to go into the electric cars that they need to have in North America. And as a result, we're losing that electric vehicle battle to the Chinese. And it all comes down to the supply chains and the fact that they've made the compromises that we seem to be unwilling to make in North America.
Oh, it was certainly a gangster move to take the EV market over like that. Hard to get out of that now. I think one horrible but interesting thing about the Australian market is we let our own onshore car manufacturing industry die because it wasn't economic, using air quotes, or strategic. So in a bizarre way, Australia will benefit from the Chinese EVs because there's no need for us to put a tariff on them, because we're not protecting anything. But I mean, car manufacturers elsewhere in the world will be looking at what happened in the solar panel industry, which was quite competitive for a while. But eventually that just got destroyed else from anywhere apart from in China. It just could not compete with the sheer scale. But, it's a bit, the Chinese government gets in there. I mean, it's a whole different scale to other things we've been talking about. They get in there with the money and they subsidise those industries and build them up to a scale where you just can't compete with them. But it's at a different level. But Joe Biden, the US government, putting $170 million in to build a manganese plant in Louisiana is a bit like that. It's a bit like the government picking winners or just subsidising things that would otherwise perhaps not be quite economic, but doing it for other reasons, for political, geopolitical and security reasons. I think that's something that the Western world's going to have to deal with, and because it will make things more expensive. And, inflation is an economic scourge in the world, which, apart from Australia, seems to be coming under control. But if you think about all of this friendshoring of supply chains for these materials, which go into making everything, is going to be inflationary as well. And I think that's another thing that's not often spoken about because it will just add costs. But that's just a fact of life, which brings me to another thing, which is interesting to talk about. There's one group here which doesn't get spoken about, but has the power to change things more rapidly with money, and that's the Western consumer. Now we talk, let's use nickel as a case in point. People buying a nickel-based battery in an electric vehicle. Do they care if the nickel's come from Sulawesi or if it's come from a nice ESG-compliant nickel sulfide deposit in Canada or in Australia or elsewhere? And if they care, would they pay another $300, $400, $500 for a vehicle that had a battery chemistry which was ESG compliant? Now, just using nickel as an example there, but you can apply that actually to a whole lot of things. Now,
manganese, cobalt, germanium, the list goes on.
It does go on. And, we'll all of our countries, so we have a Made in Australia campaign just for local things, just to try and get people to buy locally. But, if the world started a made, ethically sourced, we have tuna, for example. Tuna, we have diamonds, which are ethically sourced. But if we had metals in manufactured materials, which were certified as, ethically is probably the wrong word for most of it, but had some sort of ESG type accreditation, would people pay premium, or as it gets called, a freemium for that? Now, I don't know the answer to that, actually. I really don't. But if people would or could, then that would fundamentally change the economics of doing a lot of these things to try and broaden out the supply chains. Given the level of political discourse that goes on in public these days and on social media, I have my doubts, but it may be a ray of light of a way of dealing with this, just to get more money involved in the whole process.
Yeah, it's an interesting quandary. One of the policies that has been suggested, again, by the Democrats, not that I'm picking sides, that struck me as somewhat interesting, because right now they're subsidizing electric vehicles at the consumer level. So a consumer wants to buy an electric vehicle, the U.S. government will provide a subsidy of, I believe it's $7,500 per vehicle to help outlay the cost. Discussion has been shifting those subsidies away from the consumer to the manufacturer to make sure that they're sourcing their critical metals ethically in an ESG friendly manner that would give cost controls to the components of the vehicles and bring the cost of the car down. So rather than the consumer getting the carrot, the manufacturers get the carrot to bring the costs down and to make the vehicles more affordable. It's certainly an interesting supposition to it. But the funny thing with ESG, and we talk about it a lot, but it seems to be just strictly a metric for investment bankers to, feel like they're being good to the environment. When push comes to shove, I don't even think the average consumer even knows what ESG is.
There is an education piece here, and I mean we've spoken in the past about the education piece around just the mining supply of this stuff and where does it actually come from. It is so poorly known in the general public, but then to elevate the discussion to where it comes from and then where it gets processed and the social and environmental impacts of that, and paying a premium to ensure the security of supply with the least amount of environmental damage possible whilst maintaining a social license to operate and be able to expand the supply of all of it to give you the stuff you want. I just don't know even where you start with that, Mike. That is a big discussion. It really is.
Yeah, but again, we're not even having that discussion. And if we're gonna, and if we agree, and that compromise has to be made in order for us to reshore these types of industry, these conversations have to be had, or otherwise it's going to catch people by surprise. There'll be groups and organizations that in the existence of a vacuum will happily put in information that may not be accurate or be favorable into the equation that people will hear, and it will shout out the sensibility of what needs to be done. But we keep talking about this reshoring, and this is the one thing that I kind of, from an ESG kind of lens, look at. And it's like, okay, well, we let China do this because they have no laws for, human resources or environmental or safety. So we let them do it. Are we just simply going to move that to another developing nation? Let's, pick some place in South America, just at random, and allow them to do it because they don't have any rules either. Are we not just trading one environmental and social problem for another? But I guess it's in a friendlier country because we're not willing to do it ourselves.
Yeah, I think even that, I mean, it's a bit nasty to talk about, but I think even that strategy has a time limit on it. I think the world in general is a bit more organised and educated now. It's a bit more would be resistant to it, and I think certainly the Western mining companies can't be party to that anymore. They're under a lot of scrutiny, and they don't want to operate that way either. They really don't. So I don't know if that's an option. Actually, I don't know if that works as an option for these new supply chains, if you like. But I think that idea, or that what you said there about the government subsidising the car industries to source their materials from a better supply, if you like, rather than subsidising consumers, is interesting. And it goes, it flies in the face for the pure economists. They hate this stuff, but anything to do with the subsidy or any, hint that the government's trying to pick winners. But, sometimes these things start out by the governments themselves in their own procurement saying, well, we're only going to buy stuff in the future that complies with these requirements. And that's often a way to motivate people to make change as well. Because the government will say, yes, it will be more expensive, but it needs to meet these requirements and we'll buy that. Now, it's another form of subsidy, of course. In the end, the taxpayer pays for it. But it has to start somewhere, right? These drivers of change need to happen somewhere with the full understanding that things will be more expensive and someone has to pay, but let's get going somehow.
No, we mentioned the manganese process. There are some little bright lights here and there. The United States has opened its first uranium processing, or rather reopened it. So they're
Mm.
going to be able to get the more highly enriched uranium that they need for the SMRs, or the small modular reactors, that seem to be the future in nuclear energy. And there's talk about doing more of that. Interestingly enough, the government of Saskatchewan, little prairie province up north in Canada, has a government corporation called the Saskatchewan Research Council, and they're opening a rare earths processing plant in the province of Saskatchewan, particularly for the rare earths that are found. For those of you who are familiar, in the northern Saskatchewan, there's the Athabasca region, which is probably one of the largest uranium fields in the world. It makes the Saudi oil field look like peanuts compared to anything else. But within those uranium fields, there's all sorts of rare earths that they can process in their backyard in Saskatchewan, and that government seems to have had the foresight to say, "Hey, we can process that here." So there does seem to be some flickering of hope out there, but again, as you say, this could take years. And we talk about the U.S. election. Former President Trump started a trade war with China. The Biden administration has done nothing to stop that trade war. In fact, on electric vehicles, has placed as the Canadian government, 100% tariff on Chinese-produced electric vehicles entering the North American market. And former President Trump has threatened to add even more tariffs. So is it possible that, in response to more tariffs, the Chinese cut off more of these critical metals from even getting into North America and the Western, productivity? They've done so with germanium already, antimony. They've limited the nickel from getting out of Indonesia. We had a little bit of a challenge with the silicon chips that we use for microprocessors, which affected our auto industry quite significantly. Is that a possible problem? And if so, does that speed up our need for compromise?
Yeah, we'd hope that we don't get there, but that is the sort of problem that we leave to the politicians, for better or worse. But so just a couple of comments on that. The tariffs and everything. Again, I'll go back to a previous bit there. This all adds to inflation. It's all inflationary, and I don't think people think about that too much either. And if it gets to a tit for tat retaliation type thing, that is absolutely a zero-sum game, because we will not have a good deck of cards to play with that for 10 or 20 years. So I don't think that's a game we should try and start, really, not for quite a while.
No, I'm certainly in agreement, but again, it's up to politicians who don't necessarily see things appropriately.
Yes, well, especially up in your part of the world. The world waits with bated breath to see what happens on the first Tuesday of November.
Well, if the Americans are lucky, they might have a new president in time for Christmas. It'll be, that'll be the election's Christmas present. They'll know who the president will be, or maybe not. It's hard to say. It's up in Canada, at least I could grab a bucket of popcorn and just watch the show. But yeah, so we've talked along. There's all sorts of challenges, but I think the biggest challenge is communication. Where do we need to start to communicate the fact that we need to bring these critical metals online in order to shore up the supply chain, in order to get to that green economy that everybody wants to have? And what are the compromises, and what are we willing to live with, and what are we not willing to live with? But we can't have those decisions without people talking to each other.
No, but it is interesting to reflect that, 5 years ago, these discussions weren't being had in public really at all, particularly, I don't think, maybe here and there, but it's a pretty common thing to hear people talk about now, politically, across countries and between countries, which was not the case a few years ago. So that's good, and that all starts the education process. We have these green shoots of bits and pieces that are happening. But I think if there's a dimension to this which is really problematic, it's just time, like everything, uh, time won't bend to us, we bend to it. And to solve some of these things is going to be expensive and take time. And I think if there's a more honest discussion around the financial cost of doing it and the time it's going to take to get it done, then I think that some of the political outcomes will be more rational, and that we won't, and just one of those being we're just talking about, we won't start picking fights that we have no hope of winning, for example, if people have an honest opinion of what this is going to take. But if there is that honest opinion of what this will take, then the financial, the economic metrics of getting it done can be looked at in quite a different light as well. And I think that will help. I mean, money greases the wheels of everything. But if that would help the community education, there are all of the NIMBY type aspects, but we'll talk about this in London, the whole Schrodinger's aspect of this. Everything you want to happen and everything that is happening can't all be true at the same time. And there are lots of conundrums in there, but we can talk about that. But look, where we've gotten to in the last few years with the level of discussion about this and what's happening on the ground has gone from almost zero to quite something. I just think the rate of change of that needs to step up materially. It almost needs to be exponential.
Yeah, or we could go back to that very first podcast and we talk about the gap. And we could be
The
still
gap,
talking about the gap for another 10 years without the compromise. So,
yeah. Well, that gap was at the mining side, but now we're talking about the supply chain side gap and another gap.
lots of gaps and no compromise. It's a world that needs to change. If people want to follow your work, Dr. Dave, where will they do so?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn fairly regularly, or irregularly, but they're enough. Obviously, listen to your podcast, Mike. But if they are interested in talking about any aspects of this in detail, then the easiest way is just to contact me on LinkedIn, just to send me a direct message. Might take me a while to get it, but I will.
You and I were talking about a little bit about your travel schedule for the rest of this year and into next year. I believe you're going to be at IMARC in Australia. If people wanted to talk to you, they could track you down there. That's in Melbourne this year, if I remember correctly.
Sydney.
It's in Sydney, but moves around your country. So it must have been Melbourne last year. It's in Sydney this year. You're going to be in London the first week of December at the Resourcing Tomorrow event. There's another good place for people to track you down and pick your brains. You're going to be at the AIM-BC Roundup in Vancouver in the third week of January. And then you're back over here in the pond one more time for the first weekend in March at the PDAC convention in Toronto. So lots of places for people to track you down and ask you questions. And trust me, Dr. Dave is a great person to talk to, and his answers are always well thought out.
Thanks, Mike. It makes me feel a bit tired just thinking about it all, but indeed, and always happy to have a chat. And yeah, people should just reach out.
Well, there's nothing like getting the jet lag happening now to avoid the rush later.
Yeah, that's right.
As much as I complain about mine, yours is always way worse. You got further to come. So look forward to seeing you in London, and we'll record our next installment of the of this discussion on Schrodinger's mining dilemma. So until then, thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. See you in London.
Prospector News Podcast is for educational purposes only. The opinions expressed are those of the participants and are not to be taken as investment advice. Listeners need to do their own due diligence and seek advice of a licensed investment advisor.